and see whether they have any views on transcription itself, whether it's accurate or not. So once we have done all that, then we organize the data. So we look for the data points. What is important here? Again, this is also very similar to the other qualitative approach in terms of analysis. We pull out the important quotes that make meaning, that's very meaningful. The third step is the step that's different from other qualitative approach, in the sense that we are crafting the narrative. This is what we call the interpretive text, the narratives itself. So these are things we look out for. Remember the three-dimensional space. Then we will find out, when we make meaning with it and plot it, what is the plot of the story? Where does the story take place? How did the story begin? How does it progress? So we'll come up with that story, the first draft of that narrative. And with the first draft of the narrative, we go to step 4. We share that narrative with the participants and ask them for their views. Because then they'll see their stories being told and their stories being interpreted in the form of a story. So then it helps them to make meaning of the experience which they have shared with us. And it is a very enlightening process for them. Quite a number of my participants feel, wow, I never saw it that way. Thanks for sharing. And it is very impactful for them to see what has been happening. And then they can make decisions on how to move on, for example. And then the step 5 is we redraft based on the feedback. And then we send it back for them to have a look. And finally, we reflect on the narrative with the literature itself. So these are the 6 steps of constructing that narrative. All right, narrative inquiry. Remember I highlighted the book written by Candidate and Connolly in 2000. It's been 2 decades since that book was published. So over this time, the approach has proliferated across the research world. Quite a number of people have adopted it and used it for their research papers. Over time, particularly in applied linguistics, there are some changes, some adaptations of their approach to make it a more amenable, more useful and practical for the applied linguistics research. So for example, Gary Buck-Hewson, who I recently had a chat with over meal to talk about his approach. He came up with this narrative frame, 2008, because he needed to collect data from a huge group of participants, 100 over, and it's impossible for him to do what Clendenin and Connolly suggested, building that relationship with 100 over people. How is that possible? Following them through, meeting them for meals, for coffee, for example, having long chats. So he needed to find a way to be able to quickly collect their stories, their narratives. And so he came up with this particular way, a frame. He calls it a narrative frame. Have a look at the instructions at the bottom, number 2. Write a coherent narrative. In other words, link each either to the next, like you would in a story. So he provided frames with some guiding sentence stems for the participants to complete. Yeah, of course, this is an approach that Clendenin and Connolly would not agree with, but yeah, it has been released. The word has been released. So it's up to people to do what they wish with it. And Buck-Hewson, 8 years later, came up with another approach of analyzing narratives. He calls it a short story approach. Have a look at the point in blue. They analyze thematically in detail on both content and context. So let me share what that would mean. He highlighted again, or rather highlighted for him, systematic thematic analysis. So he looked at the short story segments. He's not looking at all the data, but only short story segments of that interview data. Then he who, from it, you look for the who, where, and when. Quite similar to the three-dimensional dimensions, right? The 3 dimensions. But the next one we looked at is slightly different, which is story, story, and story. The 3 different types of story. He calls it scales of context. So when looking at who, when, we need to look at the type of stories, the scales. So the first type of story he's looking at will be the inner thought, the small letter story. That which resides within the participant. Then the next one is the capital S story, the immediate context of the participant itself. And then finally, the capital story, we look at the broader context that affects the participant. So this is how he looked at it for each short story segment that he pulls out from the data. Again, possibly Diamond Economy may not fully agree with this side as well. But it is an approach. These are different approaches. And I'm sharing with us these approaches because in applied linguistics research, Gary Barthuson's approach is very popular. Yeah. So it's something that you should be aware of if you are thinking of approaching narrative inquiry. Okay, at this juncture, I'm going to pause. This is my email. You can scan if you want to find out more information. At this juncture, I'm going to stop it, and then we're going to have a question and answer. All right? Okay. If you don't have time for questions for today, or if you have questions that you think about after today's session, or you're a bit shy about asking questions, possibly you can drop me an email as well. Okay? Okay. Right now, let's think of some questions. What questions do you have about narrative inquiry?
Okay. Introduce yourself.
Hello, Professor. I'm Terry from
Okay.
Just want to ask you about, like, if we're gonna do a narrative inquiry studies on students, like, what kind of ways of which framework or which format, like, would you probably recommend or mostly do?
Framework.
Framework. Like you just mentioned that we have a template, right? But for students, like in Chinese context, if we let students write them, like some of them might be afraid of like doing so. So like if this happens, like what would professor do?
Before I respond to your question, can I ask what age groups are these students?
High school or middle.
Age, how old are they?
Sorry.
How old are they?
15 to 16.
So teenagers.
Teenagers.
Right. The narrative frame that was shared by Gary Barthuson is meant for adult participants because the adults are able to craft and write about what's happening and the story format itself. For younger participants, we would suggest not doing so because they may not be able to write so well. They may not be able to link the different experiences as a story itself. And so for younger participants, we would rather go back to the original way of collecting the data, which is to have an interview, what we call a narrative interview, to find out more about their lives and more about their experiences and more of what has been happening in their lives in that sense. That will allow us to pull out richer data in that sense.
Thank you.
No problem.
Any other questions?
Perhaps let me elaborate on Barthuson's narrative frames. He used it for 100 over teachers, and so they wrote it. And then he analyzed it by pulling out, let's say, the introduction of the story. So he put out all the introduction together to analyze for theme. Then he put out all the resolution, all the information together and analyze it for a theme. And then for support it that way. So for him, what he essentially is doing is actually a thematic analysis. For certain schools in narrative inquiry, they won't consider this really as narrative inquiry, but would rather more thematic analysis itself. Yeah. Yes.
Hello. Hi.
Okay.
I think your talk really reminds me of my work. my dissertation is also narrative inquiry. So,
Cool.
Yeah. So my one of the questions I have is, because you just shared your experience working with I'm not sure it's in-service or pre-service teachers in the in Singaporean context, right? So my question is, do you personally have this experience that your participants, your interviewees, or do not agree with your interpretations in the whole process when you share with them your perspective of the story, and how do you usually continue this inquiry process? And then how do you present the outcome with these competing interpretations of the story in your opinion?
And that's a very important question. Thanks, Gloria, for asking that, because it's very real. Fortunately for me, but unfortunately for the question, I have not encountered any participants who did not disagree with me. All my participants over the years have always agreed with the interpretation, and they always found it very enlightening, which is very fortunate for me. However, based on my conversations with other narrative inquirers, for those who encountered participants who did not agree with that interpretation, for example, the first research text, the first research narrative, then we need to make certain adjustments to the research story and send it back to them to see if they would agree. But it's important then to capture what they disagreed with and weave that into the discussion, because that becomes the data in itself. Why they disagree with that interpretation? Because we are seeing it from a third-party perspective, in a sense, a more objective lens. So we can see, possibly we can interpret it, we can interpret their reasons for the disagreement with it. Yeah, so that's a possibility. So what I would suggest is using that disagreement as part of the data in the discussion part of the paper or dissertation.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone interested to do narrative inquiry or think of doing it?
Okay.
Hello, Professor. My name is Elsa, and I'm from Indonesia. So I'm sorry if I could not grasp all of your explanation. So this one thing I would like to know is what would likely be the best situation to conduct a narrative inquiry? Is it like, for example, try to explain a phenomenon? For example, my thesis back then in my undergraduate study is social linguistics, and I wonder if I could deliver my study in better way with applying narrative inquiry as my method. So yeah, I would like to know in which cases, what condition that narrative inquiry would be the best solution for conducting study. Thank you.
Before I respond, can I ask you what approach are you thinking of using right now?
As for now, just like a common method, like for example, interview, course, case study, because we are currently studying. Yeah, I also thinking of that as my method because I think that's to my topic. Yes.
Perhaps I'll respond by sharing with you how I came into narrative inquiry, how I decided teachers change their beliefs over time. Why they are so passionate about using a student-centric approach of teaching in the beginning, and yet after a while they discard this particular method and only choose to do chalk and talk, the traditional way of teaching, and using lots of worksheets. So I wanted to use a standard qualitative approach, which is interviewing them and then analyzing the themes for their reasons itself. Then I met a visiting scholar in the university, and she was from Canada, and she was a student of Glendon. So we had a coffee chat about it. So she asked me, why do I want to know about this? What led me to this particular topic? So I shared with her, oh, I've encountered this. I personally have encountered this situation. I've encountered friends who are like that. I've encountered beginning teachers who are like that. I've encountered many experienced teachers who are like that. And so I really want to know what is happening. So she is telling me, I want to know a story. I want to know their stories. And so she shared that the story approach allows us to find out more information, more details, more insights into how a person has changed over a period of time. And I found it connected to me. It spoke to my heart, that particular approach, and started reading up on it. And so eventually I shifted from a standard qualitative research method to a narrative